Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Before the video starts, I'd like to raise awareness on a friend's GoFundMe. Her family restaurant has been going through some hard times, and I thought I could help them by raising awareness for it on my own channel. A link to it will be provided in the description. Please donate any amount of money you want or spread awareness for it however you can. I'm not asking for much, just to give a moment of your time to help them out. Any form of help would be deeply appreciated. Thank you.
Get tickets now.
Oh, no.
For those who may not know, I recently did a ranking of all the Disney live-action remakes, and you may have guessed what motivated me to do that if you saw the title. But another reason I wanted to do this ranking was to shine a light on how, honestly, kind of underappreciated the animated movies are. And using the remakes as a comparison piece helps us to understand how greatly these movies aged. Now obviously we did like or love these movies as kids, but we were kids without more developed critical thinking skills. So we would only think about superficial stuff like the animation, the jokes, the music, or the personalities of the characters. As we get older, we come to appreciate things about these movies that we only recognize as adults. The chemistry between the characters, the voice acting, the story and the way it's framed, the themes and how they're explored through the actions of the characters, the romance between the main leads and how passionate their love for each other really was, things that for whatever reason that baffles me, have been completely forgotten about by the actual company that gave us these movies in the first place. Because apparently they don't want to be an animation company anymore, they want to be a monopoly and rule the world. So Disney has been spending more of its time buying out other franchises, churning out crappy sequels, and worst of all, remaking all their animated classics into live-action slop. And the latest victim of this tragedy is Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Now I'm not trying to say the original Snow White is one of the greatest movies ever made. It's far from perfect. There are things in it that didn't age well, the romance with the prince for one, but there's a reason why this movie is still regarded as a classic if not one of the most important movies in the medium of filmmaking. If it wasn't for its success, animation as an art form wouldn't have exploded the way it did. But I guess Disney didn't get the memo because they thought this timeless tale had to be drastically updated for modern audiences. And we all know where that road leads to. Snow White 2025 might just be the worst of these live-action remakes so far. And I only use the word might because I still stand by the opinion that The Lion King 2019 is the single worst thing that Disney ever made that isn't Star Wars related, but chances are it's at least near the bottom of the list because... wow, this one was really bad. You'd think that Bob Iger would know when to leave well enough alone and just leave certain things in the past. But since Disney just can't seem to stop remaking their animated classics right now, I guess taking another shot at making Walt and Roy roll over in their graves was inevitable. Only this time, Snow White is going to be a strong, independent woman, who's totally not going to be safe by that creepy stalker prince.
There's a big focus on her love story with a guy who literally stalks her. Weird.
Yeah. The trailers and advertisements for this stinker told you everything you needed to know because they hit all the wrong notes immediately. Snow White getting race-washed when one of her defining traits is having skin white as snow. It's literally in the title. Not bothering to hire actual dwarves because they were afraid of offending that fuckwad Tyrion Lannister. So they just opted for horrible CGI characters that look like they came from an unfinished PS3 game, which is extremely hypocritical for a company that won't shut up about how diverse and inclusive they are. Casting Gal Gadot as the evil queen, which completely breaks the plot because now we're supposed to believe that one of the most physically attractive women currently working in the industry is jealous of this 5 out of 10, removing the dwarfs from the title, seemingly for no reason except they wanted to drill in how they're trying to rework Snow White's character into being another shitty girl boss, butchering the pacing of the story by throwing in a stupid B-plot about starting a revolution against the queen, completely missing the point of whistle while you work by having Snow White order the dwarves around while they clean the house, when she was supposed to do it herself to earn her room and board, making the music tone-deaf and inert with generic orchestras that don't fit the soft nature of the original soundtrack, and, above everything else, sending harmful messaging about how women have to be portrayed as some sort of uber badass now because anything less would be considered sexist. Now, if this was something that happened in a vacuum, I wouldn't be making a big deal out of it. Like, if this was just the first or maybe the second time this happened in the last several years, I wouldn't care. But this isn't the first or second time in the last several years. It's like the 20th time this past year alone. Snow White 2025 is a representative of an ongoing issue currently plaguing the industry, in that most of the creatives currently working at Hollywood, and I'm using the words creatives with very large quotes here, are toxic, morally corrupt, money-grubbing fuckheads who every time they sink their teeth into a previously established IP, be it Star Wars, The Last of Us, Ghostbusters, He-Man, SpongeBob SquarePants, Scooby-Doo, The Terminator, The Simpsons, DC Comics, Marvel, Lord of the Rings, Doctor Who, The Powerpuff Girls, Looney Tunes, Star Trek, Pixar with their unnecessary sequels, DreamWorks with their unnecessary sequels, and live-action remake of How to Train Your Dragon apparently.
What? No! Sorry, force of habit. Lisa, no!
Or Disney with their god-awful live-action remakes just cannot resist the urge to fuck with something that absolutely did not need to be fucked with and completely ruining it for everyone. You know that long bucket list of stuff I went over a moment ago? These were things that Disney just had to point out in the trailers to show people how with the times they are, when all it really did was show people how their politics and views on women, or how they believed the original Snow White was problematic, which it wasn't, were dictating all these changes they were making to the story, and that's what they wanted front and center more than anything that would, you know, make people want to see the movie. Now, if you want to update something that was made in a different time, seeing as how the original Snow White is almost 90 years old, that's one thing. On some level I can understand that. But when your first idea, and the one you put on blast, is changing character skin colors and adding more female empowerment just for the sake of having more female empowerment, all you're doing is showing us you had no new ideas at all. None that were worth rebooting one of Disney's animated films for the 20th time anyway. And what's even worse is that the movie never does anything with these changes to justify them. All these changes do is make the story worse. And that's most emblematic by the acting. If you're going to have a person of color play Snow White, then you better have a really good reason for it. Something like how she's such an amazing actress who's going to give us something that no one else could have possibly brought to the role. Something that's surprisingly great, and when the movie comes out she's going to prove everyone wrong. Well, I'm sorry, but just like with Halle Bailey, you can't play that card here. Rachel Zegler is fucking terrible. She has a total of 3 facial expressions, her body language is wooden, her line delivery is broad, she doesn't have any believable interactions with any of the other characters, the movie is riding on her shoulders, and she's the worst actor in the entire thing. And no offense to Andrew Berna, I'm sure he was doing his best with what he was given to work with, but he's honestly not much better. Most of the time he looks so uninterested in what he's doing, which on some level I can understand given the movie he's in right now, but his range is like a foot of charisma every time he appears. He could at least put a little bit more enthusiasm into his acting, or line deliveries, or body language, just anything that would make something in this movie salvageable. But he never seems to bother, so he looks like he's waiting for the cameraman to say cut so he can go for his bathroom break. Even Gal Gadot as the Queen isn't doing anything to simulate a good performance. She's the most accomplished actor in the cast, and it feels like she's just foaming it in. A lot of her performance is off-putting with what the original Evil Queen was like. She comes across as less subtle, which takes away from what made the character intimidating. She was very simple in the original, which allowed her to come across as more sinister. Even during moments where she got angry, she never screamed or put on this angry face like she's about to take a bite out of a cheeseburger. Gal's version of the character feels too over the top, which might have made more sense if she was playing a more outrageous villain like Cruella de Vil. But the Queen from Snow White was more reserved. They're trying to make her more complex with all these changes and additions to the story when it just makes her more cliché and boring. She tries to put on these really scary facial expressions, but none of them are convincing. She goes overboard way too much. A really big example of this is when she first hears about Snow White being more fair than her. The original simply whispered her name in vanity while glaring at the audience. Gal Gadot does this really large no, which feels more like she's reacting to the Super Bowl as someone who bet on the Chiefs. It just feels like she's trying way too hard. And that might be most emblematic in her horrible song. It's practically a meme at this point that musicals now hire people based on their likeness instead of their ability to actually sing because, wow, I did not expect Gal Gadot to be that bad of a singer. The auto-tuning is so rough and numb. And all I can think about was how Disney just seems to have a thing for it. First Emma Watson, then Will Smith, and now this. Like, what's next? When that live-action remake of the Aristocats comes out, are you gonna hire Pierce Bronson as Edgar and give him an auto-tune song? Even putting aside the auto-tuning, there's nothing theatrical about her choreography. She just does some spinning and waving her arms around. The songs range from boring to annoying, seeing as how they hired people who can sing. With the exception of Rachel, oddly enough. She was in West Side Story, and for what it's worth, she is a good singer in that film. but her singing here doesn't fit the mood of the song she's expected to cover. There's no gentleness in her range, and it doesn't fit the style of music they were adapting. Snow White's singing in the original was soft-spoken because it reflected her timid gentleness, but Rachel doesn't embody any of this. Because of the changes they made to her character, and the deeper range in her voice, it gets too loud and the unfitting orchestra doesn't help. They're trying to make it sound like a Broadway musical, but that's not what Snow White was. It was a fairy tale. The softer, childlike composition of the original songs fit the tone of that type of story. The songs in this movie are too rowdy. It feels less like a fairy tale and more like a soap opera. Honestly, the whole movie feels like that with the way it's being shot. I understand this was something they did to give the movie more scale, and it does have some interesting cinematography when it's not taking away from the atmosphere. It's the same complaint I had with Aladdin. The camera work is overly sporadic in several scenes and doesn't just hold on to a shot. It's so overly produced and trying to be big and grandiose when it's just the filmmakers trying to flex. The original was a series of drawings put together so they didn't have this problem. They weren't trying to make the movie look true to life as much as they were experimenting with animation. It allowed for really nice views of things like the castle, the woods, the cottage, and the mines. And speaking of all these things, the production value of this one is hit and miss. For what it's worth, I will acknowledge that the movie has a reasonable understanding of color. Unlike Peter Pan and Wendy, where you're flexing every muscle on your face to make out what's happening in a shot, you can actually see stuff that happens here. There's no problem with the saturation, everything is properly lit, and the use of shadows doesn't cover up anything. With that said, the actual sets and costumes are either average or horrible. The castle, town, cottage, and dungeon look like they at least had some time put into them, but it's not anything impressive. They're pretty basic sound stages that we've seen in previous remakes, and the movie tries to compensate for it with over-stylized cinematography. And the costumes? They just suck. I refuse to believe that someone as accomplished as Sandy Powell worked on these because it looks extremely cheap. The Imagineers at Disney World have more convincing clothes. These look like they were put on sale at Temu. They're so simplistic looking and don't look like they had hours of craft put into them. They have really rough edges, the fabric looks like a Halloween costume, the colors are overly bright, and the combination of colors don't even look satisfying. They just copied the look of the original without understanding what made those designs so appealing. I guarantee you I can go on eBay right now and I can find a more appealing Snow White dress in the first 5 seconds of my search. And that's being generous. But I'll give the costumes credit. At least they're not CGI. How do you even begin to justify this? How do these people keep looking at the atrocity that is the CGI in these movies and say to themselves, yeah, this is great, send it to upper management. Everything from the dwarves to the animals to the magic mirror is painfully fake. The movie has a budget of nearly $300 million and this shit looks like a reject from the Star Wars prequels. None of them are rendered properly, none of them have any weight, all of them have really bulgy eyes that take away from the charm they're supposed to have. This shit is straight up nightmare fuel. There is no excuse for the CGI to be this horrific when you made something as good looking as Mufasa a few months prior. This right here should prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that they just did not give a shit. I might have let it slide if it was just the forest animals and the mirror, but you could have hired actual dwarves. We did not need to be cursed with these horrific abominations. All of this could have been hand-waved away as superficial if just maybe the story and character writing were any good. Well, big shock, it's awful. Now the first thing I want to go into is Andrew Birna and Rachel Zegler's romance. The prince's character was changed to make him a thief who secretly fights in the name of the king. This was done to give his character a bigger role and give him more chemistry with Snow White to fix the issue with how bland their romance was in the original. Now for all the crap I gave this movie up to its release, this was something that could have worked. Looking up the making of the original, I learned the prince was meant to have more scenes, but they had to leave them out with the time and budget they were given to work with. So with this movie having more of both, they could have done something with it. Something similar to Cinderella, where they took this flat piece of paper and actually made him compelling by giving him a personality and an arc. It sounds like this could actually work, and they do pretty much nothing with it. The love interest has more screen time now, and that's it. His character arc where he learns to stop looking out for number one to help Snow White fight the queen is extremely rushed. They barely spend any time with each other and the movie just randomly decides they're in love. There's no scene where they actually bond or learn anything deep about the other that would draw them to each other. The dwarves and the bandits just act as wingmen to them and they suddenly do a random love song. And it's made even worse by how true love's kiss is supposed to break the spell. Yeah, that still happens, by the way. Snow White bites the poison apple and Jonathan has to kiss her to wake her up. Rachel was building up her character as not gonna be saved by the prince, and she still has to be saved by the prince. How's that for ironic? But back to my point. True love's kiss is supposed to break the spell, but really, how well do you know this woman? You knew each other for less than 12 hours, you never have a real romantic moment that isn't a forced love song. You're just breaking the spell because that's what happened in the original. Honestly, this made more sense in Maleficent, because at least there, they actually knew that in order for the kiss to work, you need to have an actual relationship with the person you're kissing. This was your chance to improve something from the original, and you still fumbled it. How is that even possible? The dwarves are also less charming, and not just because of the god-awful CGI. The problem is that they were written to be annoying. Their voices are grating, their song has to spell out who's who because the filmmakers think you have the attention span of a squirrel and can't figure it out for yourself, and personality-wise they're not interesting. There's a scene where they get into a stupid fight with each other and they make fun of Dopey, which is just needlessly cruel. The dwarves didn't have this animosity towards each other in the original. Where exactly did this come from? Is it because the queen made them lose their way when she seized power? They're almost 300 years old, so you'd think they would be able to work through something like this if they've been together for that long. It's all just an excuse so Snow White can have a scene between her and Dopey about learning to have courage and kindness. And that's a weird thing about this remake, actually. They took the character development that was given to Grumpy in the original and just gave it to Dopey. He learns to embrace who he is or some shit like that. He develops courage and self-esteem and he starts talking. Now, this isn't the worst change this movie makes from the original. It was never stated that Dopey can't talk at all, they just say that he never tried. So this could have been something the remake can build upon. Maybe Dopey goes through a really great change that inspires him to start talking and it's going to be earned. But nothing comes of it. He's just more brave and he talks now. Because of how badly paced the story is, they don't really develop Snow White's relationship with the dwarves. They don't show enough interactions between her and Dopey for this to stick, so this jump in his character doesn't feel earned. And about the terrible pacing, it's just like what happened with Dumbo. Because they wanted to make this two different movies, the story progression is all over the place. The actual story from the original happens lightning fast, and the B-plot about fighting the queen drags on too long. The characters don't develop properly, they jump between different plot points too much. And honestly, did we really need a B-plot? Why did we need another movie about revolting against the queen? They never do anything to explore the kingdom or its place in this world, so it's just a pointless addition. It also ruins the fairy tale aspect of the story by trying to turn it into an epic battle for a kingdom. It's supposed to be a simple story about a lady befriending some dwarves and she helps them become better people. That was enough story content for what they were adapting, but they wanted it to be taken more seriously by making it a revolution film. And in the process they completely misrepresent Snow White's character by making her a symbol of rebellion and freedom and standing up against her oppressors. Snow White was a great character because she was kind-hearted and pure without the need to make her more action-oriented. She struggles through her fears with her experiences in the forest. She displays her gentle nature to befriend the forest animals. She shows responsibility and compassion by cleaning the house for the dwarves. She had a fun-loving, humorous side while dancing and laughing with them. And she's a dreamer who shares stories about finding happiness with the prince. She already had a lot of personality with some snarkiness thrown in. But because this is a Disney live-action remake where the female lead has to be a girl boss, this movie feels the need to make her more action-oriented and heroic and facing off against the queen. God forbid we stay true to the original by making her a motherly figure to the dwarves. Now we have to poke her with a strong, independent girl boss stick so she can get in on the action too, whether it's believable or not. And you remember that leaked image where everyone thought these were going to be stand-ins for the dwarves? Well, they're still in the movie, but as Jonathan's sidekicks. And the only purpose they serve is wasting time. They add nothing to the plot, they have no personality, they do nothing to advance the story, they're just a group of no-names that could have easily been cut out and you wouldn't miss anything. The forest is made to be less scary and impactful, unlike the original that had a genuine sense of terror and creative visuals. Snow White doesn't look like she's scared for her life, she looks inconvenienced if anything. They rush through it, which takes away from the fear factor, they make it less subtle by adding in all these reds, and Snow White is made to be less vulnerable because it doesn't end with her frightened and sobbing. She just comes across a deer and feeds it and suddenly everything's good. She doesn't even learn how to deal with her fears because they cut out the song. The movie's sense of humor is painfully juvenile. Not one attempt at comedy was any good. I think all I have to do is tell you this one joke and you'll get an idea of how bad it is. While meeting up with the other bandits, Jonathan introduces himself to Snow White proper. He says, "And I'm Jonathan, princess." And they do this stupid wordplay like they think he was saying his surname is princess. He repeats it like 3 times with an awkward 5-second pause. This joke was so bad I don't even think Rachel was acting anymore. She actually looks confused and flabbergasted by this being in the script. This is a 4-year-old's idea of comedy, and it just amounts to filler that makes the pacing worse. It's so nakedly obvious the movie was going through a bunch of reshoots because of how aimless the story is in its framing. And the biggest offender of this is how horrible the ending is. There's like 10 different ways the queen can have Snow White killed here and win, and she never takes advantage of them. They do that stupid "you and me are the same" nonsense they did in Mulan, and all the guards turn on her in the lamest way possible. Snow White just says, "I remember you, and I remember you," and that somehow just convinces them to stop listening to her. If it was really that simple the whole time, why did anyone ever choose to follow this crazy lady? And of course they tried to justify the casting with that whole "it's all about inner beauty" argument, but if that's the route you want to take, then the casting makes even less sense with all the drama Rachel surrounded herself in leading up to this movie. Now personally, I don't care about Rachel Zegler's political beliefs. She has every right to hate Donald Trump and the people who support his politics because quite frankly they're really shitty people. But her behavior on social media does not reflect Snow White as a character. If I was asked to cast someone to play the role of one of the most kind-hearted, gentle, and well-natured female characters of all time, I probably wouldn't cast someone getting herself in all these controversies. It doesn't even make sense in the movie because if it was always about inner beauty and the mirror is bound to speak the truth, why did he ever believe the Queen was fair at all? It's painfully emblematic of how needlessly politicized the industry has become. And it just brings me back to the stuff I harped on in the beginning. There's a video by Mentally Mitch where he's reading comments of people making fun of this movie, and this one comment really sticks out.
Disney, relive the classic story.
Also Disney, changes the classic story.
Disney really wanted to have their cake and eat it too by repackaging the old fairy tale we grew up with and loved while at the same time trying to update it with all this modern garbage. It's clear to anyone with functioning eyes and ears why they did this. They wanted to make the story more accessible to left-leaning groups of people. Now you can make the argument that these are all superficial things that don't do anything to affect the movie, except for the female empowerment thing. But it still shows very clearly what Disney actually wanted to do with this film. Obviously they wanted to make money off of people's nostalgia, but they also want to pander to Democrats and liberals with all this race washing and female empowerment, which honestly feels like the only reason they do this shit anymore. They weren't motivated by making any sort of original content. They just wanted to make something with more diversity and representation than if this movie was made back in the 90s and 2000s to look more inclusive and politically correct. The opening sequence where they explain why the king and queen named their daughter Snow White in spite of her being Hispanic, that's the only time this change is ever referenced in the film. They really wanted to show how inclusive they are in spite of being too scared of Peter Dinklage to hire actual dwarves, only for it to be a completely pointless change. It wasn't done for creative reasons because they never bothered with any of those. And by changing the entire core of the story just to make a new narrative where Snow White is a more action-oriented character who's going to unite the kingdom against the queen, you completely ruin the story of Snow White because that's not why people were drawn to Snow White to begin with. You can't change something just for the politics and then blame the audience when they don't like the politics. You didn't update Snow White's character, you just took away the character she already had that everyone liked. They went out of their way to make this as modern as possible, which will only date the movie in like 2 weeks. So now this movie has no identity except for Disney shouting into a microphone. Changing all these things just for the sake of changing them regardless if they do anything to improve the story is the only new idea we had. And then you morons wonder why we get so angry and resentful towards this stuff? They ruined the emotional impact of the original movie's ending where everyone is mourning Snow White's passing by making it a footnote in the plot. It's not sad because there's no feeling of loss. They didn't even have the decency to include the golden glass coffin. They just laid her on a rock. All the scenes carried over from the original that aren't about revolting against the queen are like this. It's a dour piece of garbage that never feels enchanting. It's just another disposable remake. The spirit and identity of the original is not present in this movie at all. It's boring, badly paced, unfunny, unimaginative, creatively dull, and horribly written. And while it may not be the #1 worst of these remakes, it's absolutely top 5 material. Doing a remake of this movie was annoying enough already, but they had to go the extra mile with this stupid B-plot where they do a revolution against the queen, warping it so much to the point that it's completely unrecognizable as a remake of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. I'd say do yourself a favor and never watch this movie, but chances are you already committed yourself to that decision, and you'd think the bullshit would stop here. But it looks like we'll have to deal with this again when not Lilo and Stitch comes out in a few months. So until next time, fuck Bob Iger.